Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina. I'm the host here. And my guest today is a host of another YouTube channel called Pitchfork Fiber, Hunter. Hi, Hunter.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I was binge watching you today, and you started YouTube channel 5 years ago, I want to say.
hmm
What was your idea? Like, why did you want to start a YouTube channel at that point?
Well, I'm trying to think back to that time, but I started mostly because I was interested in watching other people, and at this time, there wasn't as many fiber YouTubers or knitting YouTubers. And so I remember specifically watching Kristen from Bowl Vine and watching just the people that are in my mind I think of have been doing it for a really long time, and I remember being like, you know what, I could do that. I want to do that because there wasn't very many men at the time doing it, and I thought it'd be a fun thing to do, so I kind of just started it on a whim. And then as I slowly kind of just got older, I kept doing it a lot more infrequently, but it just was kind of something I kept on doing.
Right. Well, let's go a little bit back. So you started knitting like way when, right?
I started knitting when I was probably like 10 or 11, like when I was a child. I remember I was in an aftercare, like after school program, and there was a woman who had been knitting blankets for her friends or something, and I just was so enamored by the fact that she could take yarn and make something. And I had asked her to teach me how, and I remember her teaching me, but I was so bad at, like, I would start with 10 stitches and end up with like 50. I don't know how that worked out, but I just, like, it was really fun. All I knew how to do was knit. And I remember this was back when there was no YouTube, so you had a book, and I remember trying to read the book, and it was so confusing because it was like, you know pull yarn through back loop, and as a 10-year-old that just was so complex. So um I remember that's how I learned. And then I stopped for a long time because it just kind of got too difficult. And then as the internet became more relevant and there was more information, I kind of taught myself again how to knit. And specifically in college, I remember that's when I started taking it up more frequently because I really used knitting as a kind of relaxation or form of meditation, because, like, as you know, it's so stressful kind of being away from your family and like constantly studying. And I started knitting and I never stopped.
Oh,
So
you also like did diving in college, right?
yes.
Competitively. So how was that combined in your life?
Yeah, so diving has been a huge part of my life. Again, I started diving when I was a very young child and kind of kept up with it competitively. And diving was definitely the thing, I think, well, that added probably the most stress to my life, just going to competitions and having to perform at quite a high level. And so knitting towards the later part of my kind of like diving career was very important in that, because when you're sitting in the hotel room like before a competition, I always had knitting with me, because that again was kind of my form of relaxation, and you could knit and focus on that without having to focus on anything else. And so it really allowed my mind to kind of relax. And it's really cool to see Tom Daly, who's now such a prolific knitter and so well known for that. I I am not surprised that other athletes are starting to knit or find it's something that helps them, because it really did help me kind of through those times where you're anxious or you're just excited, and all you have to do is sit there and think about what you have to do. Um, so I definitely am glad I had knitting at the time, because it really did help me out a lot.
Right. Well, Tom Daly is like very public with his knitting. Like he's sitting there waiting for his turn at the event and he's
Yeah.
knitting and the whole world is watching it, right? What was your journey as far as knitting in public?
I wasn't necessarily I mean, I didn't sit on the pool deck knitting, in my swimsuit, waiting in between turns. I think that's pretty awesome. I didn't really start knitting in public. I'm trying to think until probably till I moved to Chicago, and which was 5 or 6 years ago or so. I don't even remember, but yeah, in the past, handful of years, it just was so much more common to do things in public because you go to a cafe or you're at a coffee shop or out on a park bench and people are just kind of doing whatever. And back when I lived in Arizona, well, it was the desert, first of all, so you didn't really see people knitting a whole lot. But it just was like a lot that wasn't as common to see people kind of doing things that you like, private things in public. So once I moved to Chicago, people, you see people doing all sorts of things. So I found it like, knitting on the bus. Like I took the bus a long way to go to college. So I would get an hour of bus knitting time a day, just listening to music and knitting on my way to and from school. So it kind of started there, and then I started taking it with me, like a sock project or something with me wherever I went, and I would just work on it. Um, and then I kind of was known amongst my friend group as the person who knit in public because they like everyone thought it was really cool, and no one cares. So I just kind of became that person.
Well, was it the same? Like, did people know that you were knitting back in college or back in school?
They would, yes, they did. My close friends knew I was really into knitting, especially like if in my house, I was working on things. And I also was a fiber, I got a minor in fibers in college. So I was an art education major in undergrad, and through that process of getting your degree, you have to specialize in a specific medium. So I chose fibers and ceramics, and a part of fibers was a lot of knitting and crocheting, and you had to learn all sorts of types of things. And so a lot of my projects were actually like I guess my homework was knitting, and so they knew that. But it wasn't something I really like. I started in Pitchfork Fiber, the Instagram account, back in college, and I didn't really tell anyone that like I had two different Instagrams. Like I had a personal one and then this fiber one, mostly because I just thought people wouldn't be interested. Like I wasn't embarrassed, or I didn't really care. I just thought, specifically my athlete friends, like they don't care what that I'm dyeing yarn, and I think it's really cool. But then once I started getting, older, I realized that like people do think it's really cool, even if they don't knit, or even if they're not part of this kind of fiber community. So then I started to just kind of like not care, and realize, what, I make cool things and I do things that I want other people to see. So
Right.
I started making it more kind of broadly known about.
Well, I mean, what was your need for dyeing yarn? Because you can buy yarn, right? Like it's already dyed. Like, what was that idea?
Yeah, I mean, the first step was, I think, learning to dye it in school, like actually learning about the dyeing process and the different chemicals and things that bind it to the fiber. All those things I thought were so fascinating. I am not a very science-minded person, and so this kind of creative side of science was very cool. And you use measurements and different formulas and things to figure out dye percentages. And I learned from a very scientific perspective, but then I really wanted to kind of experiment myself and not have to do it so precisely and exactly. So with that, having that knowledge, and wanting to kind of experiment, I would buy some fiber and kind of like experiment in my own house. And then I realized, like, wow, this actually is it's not that hard. If you want to experiment, you can kind of do whatever you want as long as you have the materials. And I also didn't have the budget to be spending, lots of money on luxury hand dyed yarn, which I wish I did, but I didn't. And so really that's what started everything. I wanted to create really beautiful projects, and I wanted to showcase the things I was working on, and I wanted to use like beautiful yarns. The time that we spend knitting things for hours and hours, I wanted it to be with the most beautiful yarns. So I started finding ways of dyeing it myself so that I could save money and not spend so much. And then that slowly kind of turned into people were like, oh, I love that colorway, or do you sell? And I just never thought I would sell it because I only used it for myself. But um, that kind of transitioned once COVID happened and quarantining, and I found myself in my home with all this yarn, and I thought, what, here's a great opportunity to make a profit off of it. So that's kind of like slowly how it trickled into becoming Pitchfork Fiber.
How was it received? Like when you first announced to the world that you're selling, like was it immediate success? Was it difficult to build that customer base?
I think that I mean, thankfully to social media, I don't have a huge following, but at the time, like there were definitely that I had grown a community that I felt like was we were very close, and I felt like our engagement where we talked about things and shared were really, it was a really tight knit community. And I find that that's something so cool about the knitting world, is that you can like live anywhere and feel like you're actually really close to people. And through that, I found that I was very surprised at how great people received it. Like I remember I released a video like announcing that I had lost my job from COVID, and that I was wanting to maybe put more energy into dyeing yarn and hopefully selling it. And if people wanted to help support me, like that would be the best. And I, the first kind of batch of yarn, I had no idea how much yarn to make, whatever, but I pretty much almost sold out within the first few days, which was really exciting. And then from there, it was like, I think once that initial that initial start happened, it was then from there, it was kind of, that was the starting point, because I knew that people wanted to help support me and were excited about my first launch. But it was how am I going to now take this and keep it and sustain it?
Right.
So that was more difficult after that first launch. But then since then, I kept making more colorways and sharing it on social media, and then that kind of just, it snowballs into being kind of what it is today.
Well, so what's your repertoire of colors? Like, do you have like some colors that you always have in stock, and then some colors new colors that you work on? Like, how do you approach colors?
Yeah, normally I approach colors in kind of a collections style. So when I release colorways, it's normally within a collection, kind of a color family or a theme or an idea. And within that color story, they're often very aesthetically like pleasing to one another. So you can kind of pair any, colors together so that they'll look good. And I do that very intentionally, so that when people go to buy my yarns, they don't have to worry about like, oh, I like these two colors, but they just look so different from one another, they won't go well together. I really wanted to make the process of choosing colors for projects a lot easier. So I do that. However, I do have a couple colorways, like this colorway right here, which is Duck Boots. This is one of my most popular colorways. This is one of the first colors I ever dyed, and it just is such like a staple brown that kind of goes with anything, that I continually re-dye it and dye it because people keep wanting it. So it's one of those things that I'll keep dyeing things even after like the collection has kind of gone, if there's still a want for it. But I love coming up with new colors. That's definitely what keeps me inspired and keeps me wanting to kind of come up with new creative ideas. I love coming up with ideas about things that are maybe not expected. Like I think everyone comes out with such beautiful colorways, and there's so many beautiful dyers that come out with like really just beautiful things, but it's how are you different in a sea of so many? And so I constantly am trying to think of how I can maybe come up with something that is maybe unusual or a little bit different from what people would expect, to try to make something different.
Right. Is naming colors difficult for you?
I wouldn't say it's difficult, but it's definitely not, it's something I have to think about. I know some people that come up with the most creative things like immediately, and it's like they definitely should work for, a nail polish line or like something really creative. I would say I'm not as natural at it. But I love to like research color names. Like I love going online and just looking through all these names to see like what people have already specifically like wall color, like paint for walls. I love looking at that. I love looking up makeup, like all those makeup names, because often like you mean there's so many shades of neutrals and skin tones. Like how do people come up with different names? So I love thinking about that. But I would say I definitely get help from my boyfriend. He's a lot more like imaginative when it comes to like names. I like coming up with the color story, and then I often come up with the color story and ideas, and then I name them afterwards. However, there have been a few times where I'm dying and I'm like, this, like, it's too perfect not to name it. But no, most of the time the naming process comes after I've dyed the colors.
Right. Well, you mentioned that there is like scientific part to the dyeing process, and there is also the art part, right?
Mhm.
If somebody bought yarn from you, let's say last year, and then they decided to make a sweater visit this year, and they played the yarn chicken and lost, and they're
Yeah.
gonna buy this one extra skein, would that match? Like, what's
Yeah.
how scientific are you in your dyeing? Like,
Yeah. I would say, I mean, my colors, I definitely spend a lot of time making sure that what I put out is consistent and also accurate to what people see on the computer, because with like it is very hard. I've received yarn where I thought it was green and it came back blue, still beautiful but just different. And I think that if you can take that kind of surprise or like guess out of it, it makes the buying process so much better. And then people know, okay, like they know what they're going to expect when they buy from you. So I definitely dye with a scientific, like I have recipes and I use exact measurements when I dye. However, there's always that, part of the dyeing process. I'm not dyeing in humongous quantities where, a little bit extra won't really matter. I'm dyeing in such small quantities that, a 64th of a teaspoon, which seems like not a lot, ends up being a huge difference. And so there's always room for error, but for the most part, they'll always be, consistent. And that's on my label or on my website. I often say, like, if you are using multiple colors of hand dyed yarn to kind of stripe them or kind of alternate skeins, because it really does help. But for the most part, I'd say it's pretty consistent. But there's always that
does it help
room.
the fact that you're a knitter with the yarn dyeing process or business?
I definitely think so. I think it would be hard to be a yarn dyer. I wouldn't say it's hard, but it would be very different. Like I know there's a lot of yarn dyer companies where like it's owned by a couple or by a family, and the husband dyes. The wife is the knitter and does a lot of the more public facing things. Like I know there's a lot of companies like that, and I think that that's awesome, because dyeing is a very different part of kind of your brain in a way. Like it is much more exact, it's precise. There are specific rules. Sometimes, like I say rules lightly, but there's things you have to do to make sure your yarn doesn't felt or you get the best results. But then knitting is a lot more, I think it can be a lot more expressive or creative in a different way. So I definitely dye colorways that I would want to knit, and that oftentimes I think could be used in really creative ways. And I also love to stay on top of kind of current trends, or like I feel like every few months there's a new pattern that blows up and everyone's knitting. And oftentimes those are kind of like more female oriented patterns. And so I'm not necessarily always knitting the most current or up to date things, but just knowing about them, like knowing that a certain shawl is really popular. Well, maybe I'll create a 3 colorway color story that's going to look great in that, because people would want that. Knowing those things really does help from the more business side of the business
Yep.
side of things.
Right. I mean, I have like a split feeling about that in a sense,
Yeah.
because on one hand, like I understand that this is like a smart business decision to go with what's popular out there and offer a variety of product for that specific things. Like, but on the other hand, there's like, I mean, there are tons of designers out there. And I feel like if everybody concentrates on just the top 20 popular designs, it puts everybody else in the shadow.
Totally.
Do you have like any pet projects where you'll take an unknown designer and try to advertise their new pattern with some colors or something like that?
Yes, absolutely. And I totally agree with you. I think, it's like this in so many things, in fashion, and, really everything. It's like the people that are at the top, and they're going to stay at the top kind of no matter what. And so I do love finding designers that are not as popular, or, I'm the person who will search through Ravelry to the 30th page. I go deep into things because often, and I do think being a male and knitting for men is different, because there aren't, like, other than a couple designers, there's not a ton of designers that are making patterns. So often to find what I want, I have to dig deep, or I have to use a pattern and modify it pretty heavily to what I want. So I would say that in a way that makes it better for me, because then I can find designers that aren't in that top tier, or that I think deserve to be highlighted. I'm trying to think of a couple. I knit a cardigan a long time ago. It was a pattern called the Antonio cardigan, or Antonia. It was like it was unisex, but very few people had knit it, and I just thought it was perfect, and I knitted it in one colorway. And then I loved it so much I wanted to knit it again. I knit it again, and then all of a sudden, a lot of people, like, since I posted about it, a lot more people were like, "Oh, that's such a perfect staple cardigan. It's so simple. It fits great." And a lot more people started to knit it, and I thought it was really cool, because we do have influence over what people see or do. And so I thought that was really cool to think that, like, I could help highlight a designer that didn't have 5,000 garments projects on Ravelry, or have thousands of tags on Instagram. Like, being able to highlight that was very important. And it also, I got to dye the yarn and showcase my own things too. So in a way, it helps everyone if we're if I can uplift them through also showing off my work. I think it's a win-win. So
well, do you like collaborating with designers? Because like a lot of yarn dyers seek those collaborations so they can promote your yarn while you're promoting their pattern.
Yeah, to be honest, I've not done that a ton in the past. I think just because of like the scale, oftentimes those big designers or the big dyers that can work with those designers have to have the ability to produce a lot. And I'm still not quite there. And that's something I was on an interview with someone else, and they asked me what my goals were for 2022. And definitely being able to kind of work on being able to produce more. It takes a long time to just make 4 skeins of yarn or 8 skeins of yarn. And for me, that is where, like, I don't have a huge studio where I'm able to dye 100 skeins at once. So I would love to do that more, but I think that's something I want to work with more. I have a few things in the works, let's just say that are not quite out yet, that hopefully will be kind of making appearances in the summertime. So they're in the works, but I definitely want to work with more designers, because there's so many, like you said, that are producing such fabulous work that don't necessarily get that super spotlight attention that I think they deserve. And so if I can be a part of that to help, shine light onto them, and especially our, queer and POC designers too, because oftentimes they're thrown to the margin just because of like the way the knitting world works. And so, that's another thing that, like, I want to do on my platform, is to highlight people of color that, that deserve to be highlighted. So.
Right. Well, talking about the goals for the 2022, I know this is like part-time gig for you,
Mhm.
the whole Pitchfork Fiber, and your main job is like, you know, demanding as well. Like, was that ever your ambition to go full-time with yarn dyeing?
I've been asked this a couple times, and lately it's funny because so during COVID, my whole career, like it really just threw everything up in the air. So I started off my background in like kind of my full-time work I do. I work in nonprofit spaces producing events, like being a public programmer or developing programs and activities for communities often. So that takes, of course, that's a full-time job. It takes a lot of time. However, it is a nonprofit, and during COVID, a lot of these nonprofits lost a lot of their budget, or with not being able to be in public, you know, they all kind of went away. So I lost my job twice during COVID. First, right initially when it started, and then again just a couple months ago. And so each time that happened, I kind of would re-center myself and think, okay, you know what, I still have something to fall back on, which is Pitchfork Fiber, and I'm so thankful for that. But because I am such a small business, it isn't something that I could like live off of full time at the moment. And I have thought to myself, like, would this be something I would want to do full time? And the answer is absolutely yes. But do I think now is the appropriate time? I don't think so, because I'm still very young in my career, in my full time career, and kind of building that. And so I think for the time being, I definitely love having this as kind of my creative outlet. Um, Not saying that if the opportunity were ever to present itself, I would absolutely love to, dive full head deep, into Pitchfork Fiber full time. But it's actually really exciting because I just accepted a job position last week for a new job at a children's hospital, developing programs for patients and families. And I'm really excited about that because I get to work with people again. And I think that this, like being at home, constantly working behind a computer, like we talked about before, sometimes I would barely talk to a person a day. Like I would barely open my mouth. That's hard for me, being a personal person who loves to talk to people. So I'm very excited to have that, and then have this space be kind of my relaxation time, and be able to really separate it. Because for a while I was like on a Zoom call, but like dying in the other room, and like, I kind of melded it too, which I liked, but I definitely think it's going to be a good thing to kind of keep them separate for now.
Well, I mean, when you mentioned that this is relaxation and meditation, and like we all think that knitting is that, do you
Yeah.
ever get stress over that side of the business?
Oh, absolutely. I think for me, it's the fear of not putting out content for me, and I'm sure you can relate to this as well. It's the feeling like I have to be producing something at all times. I have to be knitting a really cool, groundbreaking project at all times. And there are times that I don't want to do that. There are times I don't want to knit. There are times that I don't want to have a timeline put on myself. And I think that having the perspective of like, this is my small business and I own it. And if people don't like that I'm not producing something every certain day at a certain time, then that is their fault. And I think that like being able to remind myself that this is fun, because there are times that I will like, I have to finish this project, and I'll knit for 7 hours and then be like, why did I do that? I'm gonna get carpal tunnel in my hands. It doesn't make it fun anymore. And so um I find that I'm the most creative and I make the best content, like knitting wise, social media wise, yarn dyeing wise, when I'm in this zone of being like very content with what I'm like, where I'm at. So I try to kind of do that. But I think the posting on social media for me has been the most stressful, because I feel like to gain a following and an audience, you have to be strategic nowadays because of just the way it works. And so I see people who are, constantly posting like every day, and they're beautiful photos, and it's always something new. And I definitely compare myself to those people, and I think I need to be doing that. It's hard. Like, how do you deal with that? How do you deal
Well, I
with,
mean, luckily I have Fiberchats. So because
yeah,
I'm posting 3 interviews per week, that takes care of posting for 3 times a week. Like
yeah,
I talk about people who are on my channel, which I actually love doing that because not only I introduce my followers to new people, right? I mean, for them, some of them are well known, some of them can be like new artists for them to
yeah.
discover, but it's also like my way of taking pressure off myself of like what I'm gonna post and what I'm needing or not needing at the moment, you
Mhm.
know? So like I feel like that's been a blessing in disguise that I have other people to rely on.
Yeah, no, that is smart, or that's like interesting, because now you're not the one that has to be constantly doing it. It's like
Right.
you're helping kind of facilitate something else, which is awesome. So that's cool. I wouldn't have thought about it that way.
I mean, you have your yarn to rely on. You can like, when you don't feel like putting your face on the Instagram, you
Yeah.
can just hear the two skeins, look at them.
Yeah, totally, totally. And I think like that mindset of being like, not everything has to be this production. I think that's also something like Caleb from Drowning in Yarns, who's also a fellow Chicagoan. We've
And it's
been
our
friends.
Fiberchats.
Yeah, he's he's awesome. And I think like we before both of us, like, really, before I had Pitchfork Fiber and before he had his YouTube channel and stuff and all of, his success, it's funny to think about like the ways in which we thought about things. And I know for him, his YouTube channel is super successful, but that's not just because of chance. He puts a ton of time and effort
Right.
into that. Um and I think that that's often like what we don't see as knitting people. We see just the end result and we think like, wow, this is so awesome, but we don't see, the
The work.
so much work and hours of editing and all this stuff. And I think that that's often like, on our side, knowing what it takes, it often gets so overwhelming because like you might have I know you have multiple projects all at the same time. You're probably doing one, posting one, working on another, focusing on coordinating something else. It's just so much that um it does get to be a lot. But I think like in the end, it's all for like fun. It's all for good, positive things. Like,
Right.
so
I mean,
I
what
like to
I
think,
loved about like meeting Caleb specifically
mhm,
is that with all his success story, he's so willing to share his way and what he does, what helped him, what
yeah,
channels he used to watch, where like all the tips and tricks that he uses for his own success,
mhm,
right? He'll share all of that. And I love that about the knitting community in general. Like I love the fact that you can approach the most famous designer and they're going to spend time guiding you through their pattern and explaining like each step of the way. Like that's what my channel taught me, that like
mhm.
if you ask people, they are all willing to help, you know.
Yeah, that is something, and I do think that's really cool because we look at, people. I'm just off the top of my head, I think of like Stephen West. He's huge. He has a huge following. He's one of the biggest designers of our time right now. And if you DM him with a question or, Ravelry, whatever, he's gonna answer, or he'll post a video about it to help everyone out. Or, you
Right.
know, I think that is something that's very interesting because we look at, or we often celebritize these people and we think of them as like, I've never been to Rhinebeck, but I have heard that like you go to Rhinebeck and you see all these people that you think are like famous. You're like, oh my gosh, you're so like, I've watched you, I know all about you, but I've never met you. But then you think back to it, it's like these are just normal people doing the same thing we're doing in a way. And so unlike, the Kim Kardashians of the world, who it is purely a calculated thing, like these people are in the end doing something that they love, and it's a business for them too. So I think that that's the really cool thing about the fiber world or the knitting community, is that you really can build friendships with like all types of people. And like I said earlier, they really do engage with you. I often I love getting messages from people that are knitting with my yarn, or like want advice on what colors to pick for a project, or you know I even have some of my close friends from home that like have never knit. I have one person I went to high school with and was like, "Hey, my mom's starting to knit and I want to get her something for Christmas, like help me out." And I just thought that was really cool, like, you know, that we can all be resources in one way or another for each other. So,
Right. Well, talking of knitting community, when you go on Instagram, like, is that a source of inspiration for your personal projects? Like, is that how you decide on what you're going to work on next?
yeah, definitely, that definitely helps. I have a saved folder that I like as I'm scrolling and looking. I save things that I think, oh, this would be really cool, and oftentimes they're like years old. I don't like. I think being a man, like I said earlier, it's sometimes easier to not be in this like trend where you have to be making the trendiest thing because there aren't as many. But I also am not someone like I also like to be kind of the like I like to make things that other people aren't too. So um that definitely helps. And especially when it comes to I love taking a project that a lot of people have made, maybe in traditional colors or in something, and I like kind of flipping it on its head and coming up with a unique way of making it or doing something. Like I right now I'm really interested in making um a sweater vest. Sweater vests are like becoming really popular again, or at least I think they are. And I would love to have like a chunky sweater vest. So I've been looking at all these different people making them and looking at color work, and like a lot of them have intarsia, which I've never done before. So often I get inspired by like an overall aesthetic or an idea. And then from there I go to Ravelry. I love using Pinterest. Pinterest is another huge tool I use. I'm very inspired by fashion and just like fashion design and the way that people put pattern. You know, I love the ideas of fashion. And so when it comes to knitting, I like to bring those kind of similar key aspects to kind of helping me pick what I want to make next.
Well, when it comes to techniques, like, are you the diver? Do you just dive right in and like and hope for the best?
I wouldn't consider myself just like I don't know what I'm doing, let me just do it. I love to research things before I do it. Or at least have a pretty good idea of what I'm doing. If it's a pretty simple project, I will say I always will swatch because I don't want to go through all that time and not have it fit. That's something I definitely do. But I'll read through a pattern and look at like what it takes. It's funny because there's so many people. I have a friend, Marina, who just started knitting. She came over to my house like maybe in the summer, and I showed her this room with all my yarn, and she was like, "This is the coolest thing ever." And from that day, she started knitting and hasn't stopped. And so I think it's really cool. But she is someone who she just started knitting a few months ago and is already making cabled projects and experimenting with brioche and all these things. And I think, wow, like I probably wouldn't do that just because I'm someone who wants to know exactly what I'm getting when I'm done with the project. Like I'm so crazy. I will go into Photoshop. I'll take a photo of something. I'll put like of a project that I know I want. I'll put it in Photoshop and I'll like adjust the colors and I'll like make sure it's what I want before I even start. So then when I start, I know exactly what I'm going to get. But there are people that can just go in and like willy-nilly just go and hope for the best. I'm not necessarily that person. So,
Well, I mean, but have you ever been surprised with the color that you were dyeing, that you dyed, you had an idea, you like made it happen in the skein, and then you like try to knit the skein and you're like, that's not what I imagined it to be.
yeah, I played around. Where is it? This colorway right here was an accident. I was trying to dye like a darker purple and it came out like it's still really cool, but it wasn't what I expected. And I was like, this is cool. I don't know if I would knit with it, but then I just like thought, what if I dye it in like just dip it in orange and see what happens? And I ended up being so surprised. This is the end result. So
Oh,
I went from this to this, all from over dyeing it, and I was so shocked. Like I wouldn't have done that normally because I thought like, oh, this is cool, but it wasn't what I expected. And so often when I don't like, I would say often when I'm dyeing, I'll do something and realize, you know what, that isn't what I wanted, but it's not a bad thing. And then I'll go off of it. And then maybe when I finish, I'll look at the skein and say, this is really awesome, but I don't know if this is what I want it to be. So I'll change it. But then I always keep those skeins because those are often the ones that it's almost like because they were screw ups, it gives me more freedom to play around with other things. So in a way, I think that like knowing that it isn't exactly what I wanted will help me make it into something really cool in the end. So
Well, I mean, is your following community the ones that buying the yarn?
Mhm.
Do they have the same sense of aesthetics as you, or like are you ever dyeing colors that you're like, well, I would never ever knit with that, and that's becoming the most popular color to sell?
I would say my followers definitely are pretty in alignment with what I like. I mean, I love pops of color. I love I like a neutral and a pop of color, or like I like to play around. There's so many amazing dyers that dye like super vibrant neon. I love that. I think that's so cool. I don't know if I would knit a ton with that, but I'm very attracted to that. So it's funny how like what I make is just kind of subconsciously what I like. But it is funny you say that because oftentimes when I'm dyeing, I'll think, okay, I'm dyeing a 6 skein collection. I know this is going to be the color that sells the best because it's just so cool. And then I have like a couple skeins that are just I want this in the collection to make it, balanced or neutral. And then it ends up being the ones that I never expect to sell the best. Like, for example, this skein, which is Folklore, is just like a neutral gray kind of with like brown undertones and little specks of kind of blue. And I just thought like, oh, this is so like not boring because it's beautiful, but it's just it's such a basic color. And people were like, that's so cool. And like I sold more of this than any other color in my last collection. And I thought, like, that's so random. I would have never expected that. So I like that. But at the same time, from the business side of things, I'm like, I never know what to expect. So it's hard to prepare because like for me, I find myself in this weird like limbo situation where if I dye a ton of yarn in preparation for a launch, oftentimes I won't sell all of, like I might sell out on a few colors, but some I still have left over. And then I end up having them left over for months and months and months waiting for them to sell. And I don't necessarily have the space to just have a ton of inventory. So I try to think like, okay, maybe often I'll dye like an initial batch, see how it goes, and then I'll restock them and then dye them more kind of like as the week goes on. But it's hard to kind of gauge that. So what you just said, like the way you're thinking, I often am trying to like beat the customers to it and think like, what are they gonna like? I do have this right here is my new collection that's coming out, the Après Ski collection, and this is the mini skein set. And like, there's lots of fun colors in it. There's like this vibrant pink and a teal. It's kind of like blue, and I'm really excited about this colorway because I feel like it's like these are the colors that I'm drawn to right now. These kind of jewel tones. It's like wintry, but it could go springy really soon.
Right.
And I'm interested. I want like out of all these colors, what do you think will sell the
my eye goes straight to teal, but that's just me.
teal? I love the teal too. This teal is like, I love the teal. I also am really into this kind of like royal blue. I think it's so,
I
don't
actually
know.
like that collection a lot because I like the yellow in it. I'm not big on pink, but I actually like that pink.
Yeah, it's a pretty vibrant
And
pink.
then the rest of them are sort of like just neutrals that blend together.
Yeah, it's fun. It's weird because like I love this kind of yellow mustard color is one of my favorite colors. I've dyed a lot of, or I gravitate towards that a lot. But it's funny because if I like, it's funny because I'll like a color and think, oh, everyone else is gonna like this, and it never sells well. So I always get excited to see like when I have a launch and I start to see sales come in, what the patterns are, because it always surprises me. So in a way, it's good.
Well, what happens to like everything you need? Are you always knitting for yourself? Do you need mostly gifts? Like,
I mostly knit for myself. I I think because I don't knit, I am constantly knitting, but I don't knit super fast. I'm not knitting like a sweater a month. You know, I definitely think that with the yarn dyeing, now I spend more time yarn dyeing than I do knitting. And then when I'm knitting, I'm often knitting for an upcoming like collection, or I'm trying to think of ways that I could be knitting to then help myself out in the future. But there are definitely a few projects that I have in mind that I'm like, I have to knit this. Like my sister-in-law, she's having a baby soon, and I'm like, she's someone who would really appreciate a hand knit blanket, like baby blanket. So I really want to do that. And like, but I would say mostly it's for myself.
right.
But I'm not mad at that because I really like all the things that I make and I wear. Like I definitely am someone who wears all of my knits all the time and gets a lot of use out of them. I have been thinking though, I do have some that I don't wear or I don't really care about, and I've thought about even selling them or like because it's so hard to have like all these things that I really do appreciate and like, but I don't wear them. I almost would rather other people
Right.
get joy out of them or something than just sitting in a pile. But I don't know. Do you have a ton of knits that you have for yourself?
I have what I call an heirloom collection. So those are the knits that like took me forever, and you know,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to give them away, but like honestly, probably like 80% of everything I do goes as gifts for somebody else. And I even started giving them as a giveaway just because I'd rather somebody who like really wants it have a
Yeah.
chance to wear it.
See, that's
Um,
awesome.
so one of the other things that you sell sometimes are the project bags.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw like the one I saw that was like superbly cute, and I know it's one of the things that you like, was that beer bag that was all different kinds of beer bottles on them.
Mm-hmm.
How do you decide on fabric for the bags? Like, how do you pick those?
So those I started doing those like a while back, and that was kind of when project bags in that style were really trendy. And to be honest, I just pick what I think is cool and interesting. And like oftentimes the quirkier, the better. I love things that are weird and unique that people wouldn't expect. I've recently started like moving more towards doing like ice dyed bags. I do these project bags that are more kind of tote like, and and I love playing around with the colors that way. But I love things that are unexpected. And I think that's also true with my knitting or with my collections. I love to throw in like a little surprise of something unexpected that you wouldn't maybe expect. And I hope that that's what people are inspired by or think is interesting and kind of keeps them coming back for more because I know that there are a ton of dyers out there that have products that are beautiful staple things that people will constantly go back for. Um, but I think that that's what makes this so fun and surprise and exciting for me is that I am constantly thinking up of new ways of presenting things. And so specifically to the bags, um, I've done ones with like foxes on them, which I just thought was like cute and kind of quirky. Uh, I mean, yeah, really anything that's weird.
Well, we're gonna put the links to all of you,
Yes.
your shop, your YouTube channel, so people can find something unexpected for themselves
Yes.
and
Yes.
follow you and like and maybe buy a bag or some few skeins for themselves.
Yes. Yeah. I'm excited because when this comes out, I will have released the collection, but I will be in the process of making a new collection. I hope to have one come out early summer. And I'm really excited about it because from the ideas that I have brewing in my head, I think it's going to be just like really fun and a unique spin on kind of of what you would think of a yarn collection to be. So definitely keep an eye out on social media on Instagram and things like that for what's up next.
Right. Well, I can't wait to see what you're coming up with. So now
Yeah.
you're like totally intrigued.
Great. Well, I'm excited. I appreciate you for having me today. It's been so fun talking to you, and I thank you for having me on your channel. I'm very honored.
Thank you. No, I loved having you on. Thank you. I
Well, thank
loved getting to know you better.
you. Yeah.